Hello, everybody. Today, I would like to welcome to the show wildlife filmmaker Estelle Cheuk, an assistant producer currently working at the famous BBC Natural History Unit here in Bristol. Estelle has been making wildlife programmes for the last 9 years and has directed shoots and worked with teams all over the world. Recently, Estelle worked on the brilliant global series Planet Earth 3 with the one and only David Attenborough narrating. We will be hearing about Estelle's experiences on such a massive series, her favourite moments on location, how she got into the industry, and much more. Welcome to the Explore the Road podcast. So I've already done an intro, so people know a little bit about you. But where are you currently working and what is your current role?
At the moment, I'm an assistant producer at the BBC Natural History Unit in Bristol.
And how long have you been working at the BBC? How long have you been working in wildlife film?
I've been working in wildlife film for about 9 years now, actually. It feels like quite a long time.
When you say you've been working in wildlife film, is that you've been assistant producer for 9 years? What was your kind of role, your first role, and how did that get you to where you are now?
So, actually, my first role was as a researcher, but I was on this thing called the production trainee scheme at the BBC. And it's kind of like they have various, I guess, sort of graduate schemes. And one of which is the production trainee scheme. So I was a researcher through that. And actually, my very first job at the BBC was working at the BBC Radio Science Unit in London. So I was actually doing radio first, which I'd never done before. But it was really fun because I was just making this weekly science program for the World Service. And so it was super fast turnaround. I mean, you would just go interview a bunch of scientists about the kind of recent news, the science news that had come up that week. You'd cut it into little packages, and then it would literally just go out to actually a huge audience because it was a World Service. So it was a really fun thing to work on, and a bit of a baptism of fire, but it was cool. And then I moved from London to Bristol and started at the Natural History Unit, sort of as I was actually a researcher, but I guess it probably would have been like a trainee researcher or whatever, because I had never worked in TV before. It was like totally new to me, and that's how I started. And then since then, I actually have never left the Natural History Unit, and I don't know if I even meant to do that, but yes, I worked a few years as a researcher, and then moved up to a assistant producer, and that's where I am now. So yeah, it's good.
And the move from radio to TV, how did that come about?
So when you do this production trainee scheme, which I believe the BBC still runs, it's sort of a three-part program. So you have to do a radio placement, you have to do a TV placement, and then the third placement could be like whatever you want. So that's why I did radio first. And I mean, I didn't know whether I'd have any interest in radio. I mean, I always listened to the radio, and I guess probably at that time less so to podcasts because they weren't so much a big thing. But I listened to radio all the time, so it was really fun to like do that sort of thing. And I think it's something I would definitely consider going back into. But I think, unlike TV, there aren't kind of as many roles. So you sort of were kind of, I was almost producing this little like program really quickly because there isn't, it's very skilled, but it's not, it's not quite as big as TV or needs as many people or little aspects of it. So I always knew I was going into the TV sector, but I think the TV sector almost has a little bit more opportunity in a way. And I really wanted to do natural history stuff. So that's why, I ended up in Bristol.
And pre working in the radio station, did you have a degree? Did you go to uni? What was your kind of background in that respect?
Yeah, so I studied human sciences at university, and it was such an interesting course. So it was a mix of biology, primatology, like evolutionary biology, and then also like some social sciences like anthropology. And what I loved about that course was that it was so broad, and so you were learning like just all this interesting stuff all the time. Um, but in some ways, that was kind of also a bad thing because as I was coming to the end of my degree, I was a bit like, oh God, like which part do I like the most? Like, what should I do next? Because I really didn't know, like, even going into university, I chose that course because it looked super interesting, but I didn't really have a clear idea about what I wanted to do. And so, yeah, coming to the end, second, third year thinking, right, what am I going to do next kind of thing. Like, it was a bit tricky because it was quite hard to sort of determine which bits I like the best. But I think for me, I did think about doing something like a PhD because I love just like learning and reading. And I've always been one of those kind of quite academic, geeky people that like that sort of thing. But I think what kind of turned me off that is I was like, well, the thing I love about this course is that, I'm learning loads about lots of different topics all the time. So like, what career could I do that in? And also, we'd also learned quite a lot about conservation in this course. And I was sort of thinking like, I was so interested in that. And I was trying to think, and it was a way of kind of making a difference. I was sort of thinking like, what career can I do that I could combine all of this? And actually, funnily enough, I think when I was finishing it, well, was it my second or third year? I think it might have been in my third year. There was two things that came out from the BBC. One of which was Frozen Planet, and the other one was Human Planet. Yeah, it was those two. And I remember like watching them. Obviously, we've all watched that and stuff many times. But this time I was watching it thinking, oh well, I mean that's super interesting because like, you look at all these different things those people working on it must have had to look into. And then I actually watched the credits of Frozen Planet much more intently than I would normally watch credits. And I realized that the series producer at the time, who was making Frozen, was a woman called Vanessa Berlowitz, who now runs Wild Star Productions, but was at the BBC for many years at the Natural History Unit. And it turns out she did the same course as me at the same university. So I was like, okay, like maybe I could do this. But yeah, so that's sort of what sparked it, like what sparked the idea. But I have to say, like still took me a while to kind of have the confidence and build up the knowledge to actually go and pursue it. Because yeah, as I said, like I loved learning about stuff, but I definitely would never saw myself as a kind of, a creative, if you know what I mean, or like a filmmaker or any of that. So I didn't know anything about cameras. Like, so yeah, it was quite a daunting thing to pursue, I think. But I think everyone thinks that.
Well, interestingly, I mean, I was exactly the same. I was at uni, didn't know what I wanted to do, started doing photography, and it was discovering photography that then led me on to think wildlife filmmaking is what I want to do. And I think it's an interesting thing because I'd never thought about it either. And when you first started trying to learn, about cameras and filmmaking, did you find it? Were there areas where you found it particularly difficult, or do you think that actually, if people were really passionate about it, it doesn't necessarily matter how creative you are, you can kind of make it work?
Yeah, definitely. I think that's something that I really learned is that, especially now that I talk to people, we all have got into the industry in different ways and we all have such different backgrounds. So I think it is quite a scary thing when you think, well, I don't have any of those skills. I don't know anyone that has any of those skills. But I think especially now it's easier and easier to, with social media to find people that have worked in these industries and just ask them questions. And I certainly think that it was really only by working at like the Natural History Unit and I guess in the radio stuff that's when I started to learn much more about the production process and everyone comes in quite like raw and naive. And I feel like one of the big learning points for me was actually working in the Natural History Unit development team, because you're coming up with all the ideas, and then you really start being like, yeah, well, that's a good story. That's not just like an interesting article sort of thing. So yeah, I think no matter what skills you have, you can do it if you've got like the passion and the drive to do it. And yeah, just don't be afraid about kind of trying to pursue it and asking people questions, because I think like with any career, you don't know what it's like, if you have never worked in it. So it's just like ask people as many questions as you can kind of thing.
I totally agree. It's interesting that you mention working for the development team. A lot of people aren't aware that the actual ideas for all of these wildlife series, don't necessarily come from the people who actually are working on them. There are development teams in industry or in each production team that can actually build these ideas. So you were doing that for the BBC. And that process, how long can ideas take to develop, and the pitching process, were you a part of that, or is that given to senior members of staff? How did that work?
When I was working in the development team, I was a researcher and a relatively new one. So I just finished my trainee course. So I'd only really I'd worked on a couple of productions in TV, but it was on like sort of short term little stints because they were the placements. So I was a very like junior member of that team, but yeah, I mean, in terms of how long things took to get commissioned, the kind of process is, I mean, the commissioners do give you steers as to what they're interested in. So, you know, maybe they want the next big Attenborough thing, or maybe they want something that taps into, you know, YouTube, like user generated content or whatever it is. And then that will then be sort of dispersed among the team. And so you'll have the researchers doing all the research into it and like looking into, you know, who you could feature on it, what animals you could feature on it, that sort of thing. And then you have the APs and the producers that are kind of forming it into kind of a program, like something you could actually film and pitch documents and whatnot. And the producers are also working alongside the management team at the same time, trying to work out roughly how much this would cost. And then it's kind of the senior members of the team, like, you know, the development producers and the development execs, who then go and have these meetings with the big commissioners. And at the time when I was working on it, the BBC could only make stuff for the BBC. So they were always pitching to the BBC commissioners. And well, obviously now they do to all sorts of like broadcasters and whatnot, but yeah, and then basically the commissioners could sometimes just completely reject the idea, or they might, you know, fully take it there and then, or they might just want some changes, and then from there, but even at that point you still haven't got the money for it. It goes back into development. It's developed a bit more. Sometimes they'll give you a bit of money to do some like pilot shoots or whatever. So it's actually quite a long process. Like, I mean, it can take anything from like a few months to like a whole year to get something commissioned. So yeah, I think it's probably quite a lot of pressure, particularly for the senior people in that team, because it is it's the heart of the business for a production company. So, you know, if you kind of screw up and you don't get the business, it's sort of like, so, but it was such an interesting like team to work on, because you were working on loads of different stuff. And you were getting an insight into like what the commissioners actually wanted, like, and why they were, you know, why they wanted certain things, and, you know, what the kind of zeitgeist was at that time. So yeah, it was really good. Really enjoyed it. And a very good place as like a junior member to learn about stories and like what actually works, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting to think about the process, because obviously the filming process, the editing process is years, but actually, you know, there can also be years of development prior to these series. And so the amount of time that actually goes into wildlife filmmaking, I think a lot of people, even me, I've been working in the industry for years, it still kind of baffles me actually how long these programs take to be made.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think people realize that until you work in it. Like, I guess one of the big reasons also is the fact that, you know, all this animal behavior is quite seasonal, and now obviously it's a little bit hard to predict the seasons, and so you need all these attempts to do stuff. But yeah, it is bizarre. Sometimes you come to the end of production, you're like, I've been on this for like 4 years of my life. Like, this is crazy. Yeah.
That's interesting. So as an assistant producer, you were just working on Planet Earth 3, sensational series, by the way.
Thank you.
Absolutely loved it. And you're given your remit, you're given your episode. Because you were talking just then about seasonality and kind of being able to predict that. So it's our role to predict weather during our research. And if you could explain, you know, why we need to be able to do that. What is the process of, you've been given your animal, you need to film it. It's not just a kind of go to location, fingers crossed, hope for the best. What is the process that you go through to film something like that?
So, I mean, maybe to answer this question, I'll sort of think of an example from Planet Earth, which was highly seasonal. So on the coast episode, we filmed Caribbean flamingos breeding and nesting on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. And what we were really interested in was how the weather affected them, because they nest basically on the cusp of hurricane season in Mexico. And the reason they do that is because they need there to be enough sort of moisture in the ground to be able to build their nests, but they need to be doing it because it's very dry prior to that, but they can't do it too late into that season, or else if the hurricanes hit when the chicks are really young, then, you know, it'll just wipe out the colony. So they're sort of, it's like this kind of fine line that they're treading, but obviously, that period can, the rains can change year on year. But generally, you have like a general idea of when the rains are going to come, when the hurricane season starts.
And is that
And
you,
so
or is that the people you're speaking to? How do you get that general idea?
people were speaking to. So the scientists who have been, in this case, there were scientists that have been studying that colony for many, many years, and in particular one called a man called Alex Dibbs. And so he had a lot of data on, from years on end, like when the first sort of flamingos arrived into that area, when the colony was getting bigger and bigger, like when the first nest building actually started, because they would arrive earlier than they would start building their nest. So he had all of this data there, and when the first chicks would be born. So he was able to give us a really good idea of like, if they've started nest building in this many weeks, the first chick will be born, that sort of thing. So having people like him on the ground is so important. I mean, it doesn't happen with every story because, especially a new behavior that people haven't studied before, it can be a lot harder. But with him, we had a lot of data. So we were aiming for a sort of June filming window, and we had been speaking to him since I think like 2019, and as everyone knows, 2020 just didn't happen. But the nesting happened as expected in 2020, and we talked to him loads during that time. He sent us lots of pictures and videos from that time. There had been a storm that came through in that time, so it was great in a way because we were actually still able to gather data from him. So 2021 comes around, we're aiming for this June filming window, but then the rains come early, and he's like, okay, you're gonna have to come like a month early, because he could see the patterns were happening much earlier than they were supposed to. So we had to like mobilize much faster than we thought. But yeah, it's all through basically just talking to scientists. And you can also, there's good weather data in some places in the world, so you can look at, seasonality of rain patterns. Also, El Nino and La Nina affects things all the time across the world. So it's literally just collecting as much data as possible. And, part of that can be that you just talk to people who have been there, like other filmmakers, photographers, but yeah, scientists are kind of golden because they have the data.
It's a really interesting one. I mean, I always think we just work off the back of them. I mean, they have been in the field for years. I mean, you literally sound like a flamingo expert. You sound like you've been studying them for years. And that's because, you've been talking to the scientist in prep. You didn't necessarily know all this about flamingos before you started working on this.
Didn't know a thing about them.
But that, as you've researched that animal so you can pick the best filming windows. And then even then, it's still a little bit of a fingers crossed, evidently, because, weather patterns are changing all over the world. We know that. And that does affect filming. And these shoots are not cheap to rearrange. But that sequence, for me, was just heartbreaking. I mean, it wasn't in the end because the chick did get into the nest. But when you're in the field and you see something like that, do you find it hard to just let things, run their course, or have you ever intervened in anything that you've been filming?
So yeah, I mean, it's quite different. I mean, the interesting thing is we were going out with the idea of knowing that the weather was probably going to affect this colony in some way. We didn't know to what degree, and so we sort of were prepared for what we were going to see. But I think what was quite hard to watch was like, we had literally watched some of these little chicks just hatch like a couple of days before, the storm had kind of come in, and the water rose so fast. And, obviously to us, it's only like ankle deep, but to them, it's like a torrent of, these waves. So, and, we could see something, chicks and eggs just being like chucked off the nest. And, a lot of them actually did die. And, the parents are just going mental, they can't do anything because they haven't got any hands. And so, yeah, it was quite heartbreaking. But I think the thing you always have to remember is, the kind of golden rule is you shouldn't intervene. And I think you just have to realize, this is nature's course in a way. I mean, obviously these things can be hard to watch when more and more, I think we are documenting problems and issues that wildlife face due to climate change, which is kind of our fault, but just a little. But even in that case, you can't really step in. So, but no, I don't think I've ever really been in a situation where we've felt compelled to do that. Yeah, but yeah, it was hard to watch, but it was nice seeing the little chicks that kind of like managed to get back on because you were just like, please. And even if we'd wanted to intervene, you couldn't go anywhere near that colony. It was all long lens and stuff. But yeah, it's quite sad.
Well, in kind of on the the other side is obviously flamingo chicks are cute, they're fluffy. The parents are very beautiful birds, elegant. And then you also worked, in case you worked on a garter snake sequence. Now, a lot of people naturally, see snakes, hear the word snake, they probably have a physical reaction. How are you around snakes? Was it something which you thought, oh, I don't want to do this sequence because I don't want to be near snakes, or are you not phased by anything like that?
I'm not really phased by snakes, but I think if it was like a venomous snake, I would be quite terrified. I don't know if you watched the human episode in Planet Earth, but they filmed cobras, and I think that they're much bigger than little garter snakes. So I wasn't too worried about the little garter snakes we were filming. Plus, they're quite small little things and they're very cute, and they can give you a little bite and it's sore, but it's not you're not gonna need extreme anti-venom like intervention or something. And so yeah, I wasn't too worried, which is nice. But I remember before going out, speaking to people that I was working with about like the best way to film it and whatnot. And I remember one opinion of one editor was like, you're gonna have a really hard time making people love snakes. So I don't know how you're gonna get over that, but you're gonna have a bit of a tricky time. And I actually think that they're so cute. I fell in love with them when I saw them, and I think in the way that we filmed them, kind of using these sort of angled probe lenses, meant that we could really get on their level, and we could get really lovely like close and wide shots of them. And I think they looked really cute.
And when you say an angled probe lens, for people who don't really know what that is, what is that?
So it's sort of, if you can imagine, like a prism. So that uses basically mirrors to reflect the light, so you can sort of have so I guess normal lenses just sort of point straight. This is probably a terrible explanation, but these prism lenses allow the lens to almost be bent, and so you can get right down to like the level of the animal.
And I think it's also worth saying, actually, for people who haven't seen the sequence, it's a sequence about snakes hunting fish on the coastline.
Yeah.
So you're underwater, you're on top of water. And so did you use the lenses, this prism, did you use them for underwater, topside?
No, we just used it for the top side. So they were sort of roaming around. Before they go into the water, they're basically on the intertidal zone. So they're moving across sort of sand, rock, seaweed, that sort of thing. And during that time, we used that prism probe lens. But once we were underwater, we were just using like an A7S III in a housing. We couldn't use any of the big red cameras because we were actually, where they were hunting is in, they would sort of vary, but it was in relatively shallow water because they wouldn't go into like the deep water because it was too cold there. So we needed something that was like fairly compact to be able to get in and like follow them, because then once they were in the water, they were pretty quick. But yeah, it was a super interesting sequence to film because unlike the flamingos, we had no data whatsoever on these snakes. We had just seen pictures of all this happening, but there was nobody studying it. I think garter snakes, there's lots of various species of garter snakes, and what had been studied was their freshwater hunting abilities, but nobody had done this kind of intertidal stuff. So we had no idea how long they stayed in the water, like were they super skittish, were they not, like how often they were doing it, how many of them were doing it. So that one was a little bit more difficult to like judge the timing. But what we did do in that case was we had someone, we used resources like iNaturalist, which are really amazing data sources for like where animals have been spotted, narrow down these locations that we could possibly film it, and then got in touch with people on those islands to see would they be up for doing recce's for us, to see if it's even plausible. And again, a lot of these had to be remote recce's because it was just over that crazy time of COVID. So yeah, we were really lucky to find someone who was willing to do that, a woman called Lucy, who was actually studying whales on the island. And she was seeing the snakes all the time, but she wasn't obviously studying them. But so yeah, that's how we gathered the data. So it was not always based in hardcore science, but those stories can pay off because it was a fun story. People hadn't filmed it before. They were cute. I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's interesting for me as well. I have a lot of experience topside, so filming above, above ground, with long lenses and drones, that sort of stuff. But I don't have a lot of experience when it comes to underwater filming. Um, and in terms of, do you have any skill sets which make underwater shoots kind of your bag? Do you have any specialisms or anything like that?
Well, I mean, I would say I'm not overly experienced in underwater filming either. Actually, on when I was during Planet Earth, I was involved in a couple of shoots that involved diving, or in this case, we were actually snorkeling with the snakes because they weren't going deep enough for us to actually be using scuba that often. But doing these kind of shoots where underwater stuff is involved is super interesting because actually it's like a completely different level of kind of risk, but also the kit that you use and all that sort of thing. And I am a diver, so I do have that kind of background, but I'm nowhere near the kind of skill level of people on the kind of blue planets and that sort of thing. But it's interesting because I think that does happen in our industry where people become a lot more specialized in specific parts of that. But I mean, I would say prior to doing Planet Earth, I was actually much more specialized in actually the more people, wildlifey stuff than I was in the blue chippy things. But yeah, I've definitely done more topside than I have underwater.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned, well, actually, yeah, you mentioned before about filming people, and I've got to say, maybe my favorite episode of the series is the Heroes episode of Planet Earth
Oh, yeah, good. Thank you.
3. And for those who haven't seen it yet, because you've got to watch it, it's great. Um, well, actually, so probably best if you explain what the kind of what the Heroes episode is actually about.
Yeah, so it was really different to the wildlife episodes because it was completely focused on human characters, and it tells the stories of five different people who are doing amazing things to protect either the environments or animals that they love. So it was sort of showcasing, well, I guess conservation heroes really, and their stories. So yeah.
And the opening for that episode was unbelievably dramatic, actually, and it's a black rhino relocation sequence, and that was yours, right?
Yeah, we went out to South Africa to film that, and it's quite an incredible project that they have going on because they are basically moving. Black rhino numbers were they were decimated in the 90s and like early 2000s, and they were able to basically by moving rhinos to different parts of South Africa to kind of protected areas meant that the rhino could increase in numbers because they had more space, and also it meant you didn't have all your eggs in one basket, so that if poachers came in, which they do, not your whole population of rhinos wouldn't be eradicated. But the kind of incredible thing is, these black rhino compared to white rhino, are often in quite thick bush and quite like difficult terrain. So sometimes the only way to get them out is by air. And yeah, it's incredible because they are literally airlifting these rhinos, swinging them under a helicopter, a massive helicopter, and then taking them to another location. Because I remember when I first read about it, I was like, oh, this surely can't be safe or real. But they've really perfected the technique. Those rhino are sedated, they're asleep, and they're able to travel. I think it's up to 20 minutes underslung from a helicopter like that, completely, and they'll be completely fine. And hanging them by their legs is actually quite safe because the legs are so strong. So yeah, it's bonkers though when you watch it.
It was amazing. I mean, watching them, fly over the bush, tranquilize the rhino, then land. Were you in the helicopters? Did you get to go in the helicopters for
So
that shoot?
unfortunately, I wasn't actually in the helicopters on that shoot. So I was on the ground with the team, but when they actually went in to get some of those rhino, the only people that were actually allowed in the helicopter were the darting team, and also they did allow our camera guy in there, thank God. So they were off doing that. But we did have another team who was flying a helicopter with a GSS, which is this kind of big gimbal camera system, who following the team and the rhino. So I was on the ground, and then we had another team in the air with the GSS. So yeah, it was a really cool way of capturing it.
The well, I mean, I feel the pressure when I watch the sequence. Is there a lot of pressure on you and the team? Because, people are tranquilizing animals. It's a dangerous thing to do anyway. And having the added element of a film crew there can sometimes distract people. How did you feel when it came to that pressure of such a valuable animal, that you were filming?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of the big things is that, they obviously have so many safety procedures in place. And I think at one point we had, you know, they didn't want loads of people in the helicopter for the weight wise and all this sort of stuff. And the fact, they are going down to, an animal that if it's not tranquilized properly could seriously cause some harm. So yeah, it's quite a lot of pressure. Like the safety aspect, especially using helicopters, is quite terrifying because anything could happen really. But I think the main thing, the big thing that we do on every shoot is like you always take the advice of the scientists. If they don't want us there or doing something, it's just like you got to back off kind of thing. But yeah, you could just tell like everyone was just laser focused when it all started. And also we had such a short window to film that in because they want to, that project mostly run by WWF, they're paying for their helicopters. They have to get this done in a very short period of time. So I think we actually filmed that whole flying bit of the sequence over, was it like 2.5 days? Because they had to do it then, and so we had to do it then. So I think that was quite a lot of pressure just to try and get the best out of the sequence and without kind of overstepping the mark, because someone like Doomy, who was our main character, he was in charge of everything. So like the capture and making sure the rhino was okay, and you could tell he really cared about these animals. So you didn't want to you didn't want to annoy him. But yeah, there's always an element of risk in most things we do.
Well, I mean, that brings me on to another sequence from the Heroes episode, which I just thought was insane, frankly, and that is the one about the bald ibis. Um, yeah. So, I mean, again, it probably best you explain the kind of what a bald ibis is, and the first half of their kind of story, I would say, because I think this is insane.
Yeah. So the northern bald ibis are a species of ibis bird that are found, were found across Europe and parts of North Africa. And they were actually made basically extinct across Europe many years ago, mostly through hunting actually. And there were a few populations in zoos in Europe. And so this project that we were filming, what they do is they take newborn chicks from these zoos and they have foster parents who raise these chicks as their own. So their sort of purpose is to try and get these chicks to imprint on them. And that means effectively acting like their mother or father and getting that chick to trust them and to believe that they are their parents. So in this case, we had two foster mothers, Katerina and Helena, and they were from Austria and Germany. This is all based in, mostly based in Austria, but they kind of move around a little bit. So our first sort of section of that film was we went and met the foster mums in Vienna, in Austria, around Easter time actually, when these chicks were just about to be born. So we watched them as they became mums for the first time. And it was kind of insane because it was like watching someone have a baby, because suddenly they had these little tiny chicks that they honestly could not leave for even an hour, especially in that early stage. They had to be with those chicks, like cleaning their bums when they pooed and like talking to them like they were ibis, like for hours on end. And, we filmed them, I think for like the first 3 or 4 days of this kind of new motherhood. And you could see them go from like, they were obviously all very energetic, and then by the end they were just so tired looking. And what was really interesting about this, the whole part of it, was that those chicks were not allowed to see or hear anybody else other than the mums. And so in order to film them, it was quite difficult because we basically had to kind of be hidden the whole time. It was almost like filming some elusive animal from a hide, and we had to communicate with them like via WhatsApp to ask them questions. And that again is a situation where you don't want to screw up, because obviously if we screwed up then we would ruin this whole imprinting process. So yeah, so that was the first part. So that was all about the building trust and all of this sort of stuff, and getting those chicks to really believe that they're their mums.
Why is it important for these chicks to imprint on these girls particularly, On these foster mums, I should say.
Yeah. So the the whole point of this project, I probably should have said at the start, is that they want to reintroduce these chicks back into the wild so that the population of northern bald ibis in the wild is reestablished and increases. So they need to the whole aim of this is to release them back into the wild at the end when they're old enough. But in order for an ibis to survive in the wild, they need to know how to migrate. And they need to migrate south to sort of places like Italy where it's a bit warmer. And in a normal situation, they would learn that migratory route once from their parents, so from their ibis parents, and then they'd be able to come back and forth north to south every year, and it'd be fine. But of course, they don't have parents, well, ibis parents, so the mothers have to teach them the way to get to Italy from Austria in this case. And so that is why they need to, and in order to do that, they need the chicks to follow them, but to follow them in microlights. And so that is why they need them to imprint on them so that the chicks trust them to follow them wherever they go.
And what is a microlight?
So microlight is basically, it's sort of like these ones are actually powered by fuel as well, but they're basically these kind of light aircraft that have these big parachutes out the back, and they look a little bit like power motors. They're quite similar to that, or gliders kind of thing, yeah. So there's a pilot that's operating the microlight, and then the foster mothers are in the back of the microlight. And they're basically shouting to their chicks. So that's why from the very beginning they were talking to the chicks in this kind of ibis kind of language. And so the chicks will always hear them and recognize that and see them. And yeah, and then they show them how to get to Italy. But the kind of most spectacular thing about this is that, you know, to get from Austria to Italy, you have to cross the Alps. And so they had to fly them over the Alps. And, you know, it's actually, you know, there's a lot of danger involved in that because of the thermals, and the chicks can easily get lost. There's also golden eagles in that area, so some of them have been nailed in the past by golden eagles. And then they get to Italy and release them, and then that's them. They're wild animals from that point on. So it's kind of insane, really.
It is insane. I think for me, the microlight, the fact that they get the chicks to imprint on them, they then fly the chicks across the Alps, I just think is insane. I mean, I don't even like flying, frankly, even commercial flights. So seeing those microlights go over, you know, those those cliffs and those drops, I just thought was absolutely insane. And for you, you've gone from one extreme. You've kind of got a really valuable animal, and you know it's being sedated and heli lifted to another location. You then, in the same breath, you're filming people doing something which is just as dangerous. I mean, is either one more stressful, or are they both just equally as stressful?
Oh, I think both of them were kind of equally as stressful, because in order to film the ibis and the microlights, we again had to use helicopters, and this time I was up in the helicopter with the GSS pilot Howard and the actual helicopter pilot. And the thing which was really important was us not getting like too close to them or kind of distracting the birds, and also making sure that when we met them in the air, because we couldn't take off at the same time with them because the birds would have fully freaked out, that when we met them in the air, we met them at like a point where we could approach really slowly. And so there was quite a lot of safety elements involved in that. But you know, again, just working with people who are just super experienced. Like our pilot was fantastic, and even though he had never filmed wildlife before, but he was just so knowledgeable about the thermals and the dangers on the that you can face in the mountains, because he's been a pilot there for many years. But yeah, because I must say, like, I'm not too bad with flying commercial airlines, but helicopters, I mean, it's such an experience, but it is quite scary as well. So there was a bit of me that's just like, oh. But to see, though, you know, I remember the first time we saw them in the helicopter, and we saw them kind of, you know, they came over this hill and just these birds were following these microlights. I was like, I cannot believe that this is actually happening. You know, it was just like such a hopeful thing to see, because you're just like, we saw these mothers, become mums for the first time, and it was working, you know? So yeah, it was really good.
Well, actually, it's funny that you say the word hope, because again, another sequence from the Heroes episode. There was a very lonely frog. You went and filmed some frogs.
Yeah.
Was it the Harlequin frog?
Yeah.
The last male, you know, at least in captivity, that was being looked after, and you found somebody who was looking to try and partner that. I can't remember his name, but partner him up with a female. How did that story come about?
Yeah, so that was Jaime Culebras, and yeah, so we when we started the Heroes research, we were trying to find stories that kind of addressed like some of the biggest threats to wildlife. So climate change, deforestation, and whatnot. And we've always, with frogs, they kind of face such a myriad of problems, including this chytrid fungus, but also deforestation and whatnot. And they're also, I think, sometimes overlooked. Like, I think people just don't realize how endangered some groups of amphibians are. And the harlequin frogs as a group are, one of the most endangered animals in the world. Their numbers were absolutely their numbers were absolutely, what am I trying to say, like
Well, they were
those wiped out basically. Yeah, like I think it was like in the 80s, whenever the chytrid fungus sort of spread. And this fungus is this thing that like basically like covers the skin of the of frogs, and it effectively makes it hard for them to breathe. So it's almost like they have like a heart attack. It's horrible.
And is that a naturally occurring thing, or is that something, do you know, has kind of been born out of maybe human activity, or was it always present in the ecosystem?
So it was present in the ecosystem, but it's actually really interesting because they're not exactly sure exactly where the sort of pandemic sort of started, but they think it was being spread through people trading in frogs, like bringing them through the wildlife trade, legal and illegal, to be honest. And yet, I guess at that time in the 80s, scientists realized what was happening, and so they were taking frogs into captivity because it was the only way to save them. And so we knew that there were these places all over the world, but in South America in particular, where they had these frogs that were like some of the most, probably some of the rarest animals in the world, some of the only only the last of their kind of thing. And so we were really interested in this kind of story. And so I was just looking at lots of different frog projects and places that were holding these kind of species of frogs. And I came across a place called Centro Chambatu in Ecuador, and, found out all about these really, really rare frogs they were holding. And then they were always doing these little expeditions out to various places to try and find more of them. Because I guess the hopeful part of this story is that, and scientists again don't really completely understand why this is happening, but there are populations that are like reappearing in places of these really rare frogs. So that's kind of why they go out and do these things. And then Jaime just happened to be the person who was leading the charge with this particular species of frog. And so we just followed him on this little adventure up to the cloud forest in Ecuador. But it was quite a risky one because we really didn't know whether we were going to find anything up there. Would we just find some more males? Would we find any females? Would we just find nothing? So, but it was a really fun sort of adventure. And Jaime is just, you can see in that film, he just is obsessed with frogs. I've never met anyone quite like that in my life.
When he found that female, and his girlfriend said, I feel like in my hands I've got a bag of hope, which I just thought was wonderful. And I think that whole episode, when you see the passion that people have for wildlife and how it takes them down these routes, I think is sensational. And he did find a female. And do you know what's happened since then?
Yeah, so the female was brought back, and they tried to get her and Santiago to mate.
Santiago's the male frog who'd been on his own for how long?
Oh my gosh, how many years? I actually don't know off the top of my head, which I should.
I think it was something like 4. I think it was something like 4 years he'd been on his own.
Yeah, and then Santiago actually died. So they didn't really know how old he was whenever they found him, but he actually died. I can't remember how long after the female was found. But then because they had found the female, they were able to then go and do another expedition. I think the year after, especially when Santiago died, to try and just find as many of those frogs as possible. And they managed to collect, I think, a few females. I don't know if they got any more females, but they found males. And then they were able to breed those males with the female. And now there is actually a population. So, it's a happy story. And then obviously Santiago is not around.
Missed out
yeah. But we did, Actually, very recently, we found out that someone had created and dedicated a song to San Santiago after watching the film, which we were very happy about.
That is amazing. I love that. I mean, I fell in love with him I mean, it was interesting actually because I know what a frog looks like, but when you showed all the different types of frogs, I was amazed at the variation. I thought it was just absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I know. There's so many different species of frogs and so many endangered frogs as well. And I have to say, Santiago probably wasn't like the prettiest one out of all them, but yeah, it was very very sweet. And I think Jaime can make you love anything because he was just so obsessed with these frogs and has been obsessed with frogs since he was tiny. So yeah, it was a real pleasure to work with them. And I think when we were up in that cloud forest, we weren't in like very luxurious accommodation or anything. We were literally in the middle of nowhere in like a farmer shack sort of thing, lying on the floor. But it didn't really matter. I mean, it was raining all the time, but just when you're with people like that, it just kind of invigorates you, and it's kind of just really fun.
And that's the thing, when you do go to these locations, you're not necessarily going to hotels or anything like that. What's kind of the worst accommodation you think you've stayed in? Not just for Planet Earth 3, but where's the kind of the least comfortable you've been, I would say, on
Yeah.
location?
I would probably say that shoot was quite uncomfortable actually because we were the kind of shack that we were staying in was, I mean, there was lots of holes in the roof. There was kind of no kind of beds or anything. You were just like lying on the ground, and there was a lot of bugs around, and there wasn't a huge amount of room in this little shack. So I was actually sleeping in the room with like all of the kit, and like so I'd wake up and there'd just be pelly cases everywhere, and then like I think the Steve who was directing it and the DOP, Stu, and the sound op, they actually were all sharing one room. And then there was like this tiny little kitchen. So that was probably one of like the worst. I'm trying to think if there's any others. I mean, I've camped quite a lot, but actually I quite enjoy the camping. So, it's quite nice. But it's just the logistics are a bit harder. You can't just plug something in.
How long were you in that? How long were you in that cloud forest for? How long was that shoot?
Gosh, I think the shoot in total was about 3 weeks, but I think we were in the cloud forest for about 10 days. Like 10 days and 10 nights. So, yeah, it was.
What's the longest you've ever been on location for?
I think it was actually probably for flamingos, which I think was about 4.5 weeks. And then, of course, on top of that, I can't remember if we had to do. I don't think I had to do the hotel quarantine for that, but yeah, about 4.5 weeks. So
Yeah, I had to do that. I was 2 weeks in a hotel room in London, and 2 weeks when we got out to location as well. Actually, yeah. So that was a long shoot. Um, And then, for again, the last question on this Heroes episode, the former president of the Maldives, Mohammed Nasheed, that's an incredible story. I don't know if you wouldn't mind just talking about how you first got in contact with him, who he is actually, and how you, because getting in contact with scientists is one thing in our job, but you know, a political figure. How did you go about that? Who is he, and how did you go about that?
yeah, so Mohammed Nasheed is the ex-president of the Maldives, and one of the things that he has done from the very beginning has been a real advocate for climate change because the Maldives is obviously a huge risk of going basically underwater, and so he's been at every COP since, oh my goodness, was it COP 9 or something, kind of beating the drum for the kind of most vulnerable countries and low-lying countries. First of all, he also was the kind of biggest advocate of the 1.5 target, saying we need to hit this but stay under this kind of thing. So he's been working really hard to try and keep that in place, and also just trying to get the bigger countries to commit money to these much more vulnerable countries so that they can start putting climate change mitigations in place, like whether that's seawalls or whatever it is. Because so many of these islands, when we were there, you could see there was so much coastal erosion and everything. So he's no longer the president, but he's still at these COP conferences all the time. COP being the climate change conferences that happen every year. This one was a really interesting one. So we were looking at lots of different climate change stories, and coral was obviously one of the big ones that, it's one of the most threatened ecosystems. And we were looking at a bunch of stories in Australia and all over the place. And then it was actually kind of like the mastermind of my producer, Steve, who had watched a film with Mohammed, which was made years ago, and I think it was called The Island President. And it was following him at one of these very, very early cops whenever he was trying to beat the drum for the 1.5 and getting it signed, which I think happened in Paris. And he was just like, he would be a great person for us to try and get in touch with. And also, the thing which we were trying to do with the Heroes film was actually like try and show different ways that people can be heroes. Obviously we've got people like Jaime, who's, proper kind of exhibition scientist kind of thing. Whereas, he was a politician, and that's a very, very different way of trying to influence, policy, but a very important way, because they have, they yield some of the most power, really. So we're like, this could be a really interesting way of doing it. And so we got in touch with him before COP26. And that happened in Glasgow, which was just a stroke of luck, really. And we followed him in Glasgow. And then we went to the Maldives with him to kind of film more about his backstory, like sort of where it all came from, where his passion came from for the reef, and, where this kind of drive to just keep fighting for this, to save his country and other countries from, going underwater, and the corals for that matter.
The consequences, it seems, people might not know, but the consequences of his position are unbelievably extreme. I mean, a lot has happened to him.
Yeah. So as a political figure generally, I think he can, as lots of politicians are, they can be a bit controversial in many ways. And he was, not for his climate change beliefs necessarily, but for some of his political beliefs, he has been targeted many times with bias, with assassination attempts and that sort of thing. And actually, the year that we filmed him, was that it must have been 2021. Yeah. So earlier that year in May, there had been a very serious assassination attempt on his life in Malé, in the capital of Maldives, where he was in intensive care for months, and I don't really know how he survived, because he just had all these ball bearings in his.
What actually happened?
I think it was an explosion. I think someone had gone past in a motorbike or something, and just, I'm not exactly sure. It wasn't a shooting, I don't think. I think it was a targeted bomb, I think. But yeah, he just keeps fighting on. And, obviously we all know that these, the COP conferences can be successful in many rights, but also really frustrating. And I think every year he faces that frustration, but yeah, he just keeps going. And he keeps just trying to influence those people in higher positions of higher power, which I think for us felt like a very good ending to the Heroes film, because it was, everyone has a part to play, and some people actually have a much bigger sphere of influence, and, they should be doing something too, kind of thing.
Well, with that, interestingly, you're in this position where you're picking stories, and you're going out and filming them, you're researching them, you're going out filming them, you're bringing them back, you're editing them, and so your role as a wildlife filmmaker, I like to look at it as, you're a window to the wild for a lot of people that won't get to go to these places, or wouldn't necessarily think to, see these things, and how do you feel? Do you feel like wildlife filmmakers, are we obligated to talk about conservation? Are we obligated to film these things? Or do you think that just by making these programs, it's helping people discover the wild? What do you think your position as a wildlife filmmaker is in terms of that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because I think people love seeing the kind of wonders of the world and how beautiful it is, and that can really make people fall in love with the planet, and want to do something in that field, whatever it might be. But I also sort of feel, in my opinion, I think it's really important that we sort of show what's really happening on the planet today, like whether that's through an animal story or a human animal story. And I think we can't really shy away from that anymore, because that is kind of the reality of what's happening on the planet. And I think those stories can still be really hopeful. So yeah, and I think really what it comes down to also is the type of show that you're making, because sometimes that is just not the remit of what the commissioners want, or it could be a kids show that they want to just hear about loads of cool animal facts. So I think it just really depends on actually what you're making it for. And I think when it came to something like Planet Earth, I think the first Planet Earth was all about the wonders of the planet. We saw it from like this kind of God's eye view. And I guess didn't really touch that much in conservation stuff. I think the second series was kind of getting right in with all the animals in a very intimate way. So I think with the third series, we always knew from the outset that we have to be really upfront with like about the human world, and actually I think people have an appetite for that. A lot of audiences do, but at the same time, we didn't want it to be all doom and gloom. But I think it's this is an opinion I have from having now worked in this industry for 9 years, is that I don't think it's all doom and gloom. You have a lot of people working very hard to try and protect species and whatnot. So yeah, but I do think, especially with things like Planet Earth, where hopefully you'll get a big audience. I mean, shouldn't assume that, but you hope people will really tune in. So actually, I feel like it's a really good way of kind of showing people the wonders of the world, but also what's happening and what we can do about it, most importantly. So,
do you know any of the viewing figures for Planet Earth 3? Have they come out yet? Do you know how many people might have seen it?
yeah. So I think with the Coasts episode, because they do, they sort of do it seven. Yeah, with the Coast episode, I think at the moment we're up at like 9 million, I think. Oh my God, I really hope that's right. But yeah, it's good. Yeah, and now it's kind of airing across the world, so it's being released in all the different territories. So I'm sure we'll find the worldwide figures out soon. But
so from start to finish on that series, how long were you working on Planet Earth 3? I mean, and I guess if I say from kind of the beginning of, right, these are the ideas, this is the team, researching the sequences, filming the sequences, bringing the footage back, reviewing it, and then the editing. Yeah. How long were you working on the program?
So I was on it for nearly 4 years, and I guess I finished sort of halfway through the edit. So there was some people on it they were on it for like probably 5, maybe even 6 years, but yeah, so it was a long time, but it was really interesting because that's the kind of first big Attenborough kind of landmark I had worked on. So it was fascinating to see the whole process. It takes a lot of time for something as large as that. But yeah, it's really good.
Well,
glad I did it.
I've got to ask, I mean, did you get to meet David at all during the process of the filming?
Yeah, well, I was very lucky to meet him in July last year. So we did some filming, some pieces to camera for some of the other episodes, and then also for our the making of the Coast episode was all about Rain Island, where the green turtles nest, which Sir David had visited when he was 31, and 1957, I think that was. And so what was really amazing is that we were able to actually film him kind of reflect on that time to camera. So yeah, that's where I got to meet him. It was only for like a day, but it was still pretty cool because I didn't ever know whether I was ever going to actually meet the man himself. But yeah, so that was a very special moment.
And I'm guessing, he was a gent.
Yeah, I mean, so switched on, such a lovely person. And also just, I think what was really nice is just, you can tell that he's still very enthusiastic about the stories that are being told. And, it kind of makes you, well, as a whole team, makes you feel really proud because you're like, oh, well, if Attenborough likes it, it must be good, Someone that's seen it all. So, yeah.
Well, I very much see him as somebody who he effectively invented wildlife filmmaking, didn't he? Yeah. For us all, he invented this industry that we're all seem to be working in now.
Yeah, and it's funny because I was watching all the kind of footage from that 1957 expedition that he'd done, Rain Island being like a small part of this whole other thing he was doing in Australia and I think New Guinea or something. And you just think, gosh, isn't that incredible? Like they obviously didn't have what we have now, where you have access to scientists that you can email or pick up a phone to. And they were just going out into these places probably nobody had been. It's just like, oh my God, that would have been very, very fun. Kind of scary, but fun.
Yeah, I think that'd be really, really scary. I think it's interesting. I mean, I can find scientists just on Instagram now. Yeah. I can search an animal, find a scientist, and turns out somebody's been photographing that animal maybe for 10 years and they know everything about it and they've got a whole Instagram page. You contact them but yeah, when he effectively invented the game, none of that was around. And I guess he's been everywhere, really, hasn't he? Were there any animals before you got into the industry? Were there any animals you're like, right, when I'm a wildlife filmmaker, I really want to film that? And have you had a chance to film them yet?
I don't know if there's. Oh, actually, yes, sharks. I would always want to film sharks just because I just find them fascinating. But I've never actually filmed them yet. Never done a sequence on them or anything. But that would be up there.
Any specific species or just any shark?
Any shark, I think. Any shark, definitely. I mean, a great white shark would be really, it would be quite incredible to see. I don't know how I would react if I was underwater with a great white shark, but I think it's just like the kind of strength and the, you know, almost like the danger, but also how magnificent they are. I think, yeah, it'd be a cool thing to film. Or like a whale shark. I mean, that would obviously be really nice. But yeah, I think sharks would be the one. But I also think one of the things I really wanted to see was, a big spectacle. And that's how I felt with the flamingos, is that I had never seen that many. I mean, I'd seen murmurations and really cool things like that, but I'd never seen something like that before, where it was just like a sea of pink. So yeah, that would be. And I think eventually I'd really like to do like a shoot in some of the cold regions, because I've not really done anything in like the polar regions or anything. That would be very cool.
And with as your career's progressed and you've kind of moved through the ranks, is there anything which now you're in before you came into the industry you just didn't think about, and now you're in the industry, something that you just didn't expect would be as difficult or as easy? Is there anything that kind of you're like, oh, I really didn't know that happened, or yeah, anything that you found just a surprise that now you're working in the industry?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, I guess I probably found a lot of it surprising. I think I probably didn't appreciate how long things took, like how long you need to be in the field for some of these things to be filmed properly. I mean, I guess growing up, you did see the kind of making ofs and stuff, but until you're actually there and doing it, I think I just didn't appreciate the length of time that people need to spend in the field. And I think as an assistant producer, you're obviously not away as much as sort of some of the cinematographers, but yeah, I think it's the amount of travel involved that is a bit like, oh wow, this is way more than I thought, kind of thing, especially for some people. But yeah.
How do you know the maximum amount of days you've been away maybe in a year? Do you know that?
Oh gosh, I should probably. I mean, it was probably during the Planet Earth days. I think as soon as we were able to go away in 2021, I went on quite a lot of shoots, but I can't remember. I wouldn't be able to say how many days they were, but it was like probably about 5 months of the year, maybe, which for me was quite a lot actually. Because I think prior to working on Planet Earth, I'd worked on more kind of like human wildlife conservation things, maybe some presenter stuff, and those shoots are often much shorter. So it was the first time I was sort of exposed to these much longer things. But yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that surprised me. It's a very good question. I don't know.
Yeah, for me, I think it's yeah, again, it was the preparation. I'd never given any thought to the fact that you are talking with people. You effectively build a relationship with people you've never met for can be up to a year, and then you go out, and it's normally quite an intimate, intense, and you effectively make a friend for life. You only spend 2 weeks with them, but because the nature of filming these things, you have to go to these wild corners. You are filming in difficult conditions. I think for me, a lot of the risky situations I've been in, they're kind of stuff I'd never thought about. When you go and book a holiday and I'll go to Costa Rica, and all I think about is beaches and having a great time. But when you're going to film animals in wild parts of Costa Rica, straight away, it's like, right, oh, there's loads of poisonous snakes here. And okay, well, where's the nearest anti-venom, hospital? Oh, it's
Yeah.
actually hours away. So if anybody were to be bitten, we're in real trouble. Or, filming in locations where there are landslides and the only way out is by helicopter. I think that was the thing which surprised me most. The actual people go to some real wild places.
Yeah. And I think someone said to me recently, gosh, you must learn a lot about like geopolitics whenever you're doing these shoots. And actually, like, you realize you kind of do, because you're in the run ups, like you said, with all the safety stuff. Like in the run up to shoots, you're like constantly looking out for what's happening in that country. Like, are there random elections? Are there protests? Why has that happened? Why is that country not like that country? Could we not fly from that country? That country, well, no, because they don't like each other. You can't have that stamp on your passport. So actually, there's lots of things about the world that you kind of learn that you're like, I had no idea that was a thing. Yeah. So yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, and as an industry or as a skill set, I developed all these skill sets I never thought I would ever need. First aid and ropes courses and all this kind of stuff. Do you have a target that you want to achieve career-wise? You're assistant producer, you've been directing shoots now. Is there something which kind of, what's the next step for you? What you kind of looking to do next?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd really like to make the step up to producer and kind of have, because I think that with being an AP, it's really amazing because you're working so closely with the producer and you have a lot of kind of editorial input. But I think as a producer, you kind of can have you can really put your own mark on a film and like just think about everything as a whole, obviously alongside the whole team, like the series producer, etc. So yeah, I would really love to do that, definitely. And I think it's interesting. I think I've really enjoyed working both in the kind of blue chippy stuff, like the current production I'm on is completely that rather than the human stuff. But at the same time, I don't think I ever want to kind of give that up. And I think one of the things which, from the conservation side of things, I'd really love to be able to do is make a conservation film that actually has like no narration. It's all led by these particular contributors who are just telling you the whole story. Something like, Ivory Game I thought was really, really great. And just, to get access to people and animals that, is actually quite difficult otherwise. So yeah, definitely producer. And then who knows from there on, really. So yeah.
And with, I guess, ask this question all the time. Do you have a favorite wildlife encounter that, from your career that you're like, that will always, stick in my mind?
So many. I mean, I think actually one of my early encounters with whenever I was a researcher was on a film, a series called Elephant Family and Me, which was a series with the presenter and camera cinematographer Gordon Buchanan. So he goes and he sort of learns about these animal families. And this one that he was doing was about savanna elephants in Kenya. And we were working alongside this man called Benjamin Kailo, who worked for the David Sheldrick Trust. And what they do is they take in orphan elephants and they raise them. And these elephants could be orphaned for various reasons, whether that's poaching or their mothers have died because of like a drought or something like that. And so they take them in and then they raise them and then they release them. But because they've raised them from being quite young, they develop this incredible relationship with these elephants to the point where they will always recognize these rangers effectively who'd raised them. And they can, it's effectively like, Benjamin to me was almost like this elephant whisperer. So he was the one we were with for this entire shoot because he knew the matriarch. Actually, I don't think she was the matriarch, but she was like a very high-ranking female in this group of elephants. Her name was Wendy. And so, by this point, Wendy was much older, but yet he knew all these elephants in this group. And so, we were working alongside him with the film, but I was making for like an online piece, a little piece just about Benjamin. And he was like, well, you can come and like walk among these elephants if you want. And these were wild elephants. And I was like, oh, really? Okay. And like I had the little like handheld Panasonic camera, whatever it was, like trying to film him walking among these. And we were literally among this herd of elephants. Like there was like an elephant like here, but these huge, wild adult elephants. And it was just incredible. I mean, I remember like shaking because I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. But he was talking to each and every one of them, like, hi, Wendy, hi, so-and-so, like, and they just sort of trusted him. And, I obviously would never do that on my own accord, but, I felt so safe with him. We'd kind of seen how he'd worked with them. But I mean, I don't think I'll ever have an experience like that again, where you're literally in amongst a full herd of elephants. But yeah, and that was, I think, quite, it was quite one of my kind of earlier shoots. So I think it was just like oh my God, amazing moment, I mean, God knows if I even managed to film anything. I was probably like shaking like this. But yeah, it was really good.
And on the other side of that, have you ever been in a position out on a shoot where you thought, I'm in real trouble here? This is a particularly dangerous situation. Not because of any other reason, maybe an animal reacted badly to something, or maybe it was kind of maybe something to do with the people out there. Yeah, have you ever been in a situation where you thought, oof, get me out of here?
Let me try and think. I think one of the kind of more unpredictable situations that I've been in was we were filming a Asian songbird wildlife trade story in Indonesia for this film I made called Endangered, which was this kind of feature film for Discovery, actually, I think. And So we were following, the kind of passage of these. Well, we were working with a group who were trying to work out where these Asian songbirds were coming from, like where they coming from the wild and being brought into the huge wildlife markets in like Jakarta, for example, or where they actually coming from these like captive populations, which was apparently a legal thing that you could do. But obviously, it's quite clear that a lot of them were coming from illegal sources from the wild, and so we were basically trying to work with this team to try and stop one of these shipments coming in. And so we were kind of manning this port that was the south end of Sumatra, Lampung, I think, and stopping all of these like buses and trucks and stuff that were going onto the boats that would then go to Jakarta. And so, I mean, that situation was interesting because, we didn't know if people would become very, very aggressive if they were smuggling these birds. So, and nor did the people we were working with really. I mean, we didn't think that many people would be like armed or anything like that. So we were that was sort of, I mean, they could have been. We just didn't know. And so I think that was kind of a bit of a weird situation because we were manning this place all day and all night for quite a few nights. I can't remember how many nights it was, but we were literally like sleeping on the street, like getting up whenever a bus came through and, searching. We obviously weren't searching the bus, but the people we were filming were. So that was a bit of a weird situation because you just didn't know what was going to happen. Would people kick off? Would there be a massive fight? What on earth are we going to do? Do we film it? Do we stop? Like what? So yeah, and there's obviously quite a lot of corruption in these illegal wildlife trade sort of rings. So we just didn't know what to expect.
Do you ever, when you're ever in like, a location, good, bad, you know, do you ever just stop and think about, the kind of the job that you're doing? And, does it ever just kind of, do you just kind of hit home and be like, I'm actually doing this after thinking I wanted to do that years ago. Now I'm actually here. Do you still get that feeling?
Yeah, definitely. Like, I think a good example is the flamingos again, actually, because that shoot was actually like physically and mentally quite tiring because we had really super long days. So we had to get there so early to get in before the flamingo saw us and all this sort of stuff. So the days were like very, very long. And we were obviously there for a very long time as well. And I guess watching sometimes the stressful stuff with the storms. And I think on that shoot quite a few times I sort of had to just stop and be like, just like take this in right now because you're getting like an unparalleled view into these flamingos' lives that of course tourists, well, there's not a huge amount of tourists that can actually come there. It's quite restricted, but you could see it as a tourist, but you wouldn't be able to stay there for a month and like watch them. So yeah, I think you do have those moments where you're just like you just gotta appreciate it because you might never get to go there again, and we are so lucky with what we do. And it can't, obviously shoots can be stressful, you can be super tired, but yeah, you just have to sort of almost just like sit there and listen to like what you're hearing or watch what you're seeing and just be like, yeah, I'm really lucky.
I think, yeah, I mean, I totally agree. And yeah, I think that's probably a good time to ask you. One of the things I want to do is ask people, you know, what is one bit of advice you could give your younger self? Now, I mean, I speak to people. People contact me quite often, and say, "How do I get into the industry?" And I kind of have certain, kind of things I think. But do you have anything that you would say, to your younger self back then, getting into the industry? Or it doesn't necessarily have to be to do with this industry, but you know just pursuing this goal that you had?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably two things actually. So one industry specific one is not to discount or kind of play down other skills that you have that would actually be super useful in this kind of industry. So, a more obvious one is something like diving. But, if you're an amazing climber, that's super helpful, or a mountaineer, or someone who's very good at, doing like mountain navigation, or even practical skills like a carpentry thing, like we're always having to be very practical in shoots. And then I think one of the big skills, which I think we overlook quite a lot in the industry, and I think us in Bristol are probably not very good at, are language skills. I mean, nobody, like, there's so few of us, I think, that can speak multiple languages, and yet we're working in countries all over the world. So I think that would be kind of a sort of practical bit of advice. And then I think from a more kind of wider viewpoint, like I think it's, I feel like you just have to have confidence and to push yourself out of your comfort zone, because I think for me, what took me a while to kind of really go and just try this is that, as I said at the start, I kind of always saw myself as this kind of like academic type that like learning things, but I really didn't think that I would be able to do stuff with cameras or anything that was like super creative. And I think that really kind of stopped me from doing things like, I could have just gone and tried to make a little film on my phone, but I think I was almost just too scared to do that. Probably just a bit scared of failing in a way. But yeah, you just gotta go for these things, and definitely reach out to people and ask for advice, no matter what career you're looking at, really, because as I say, you don't know what any career is gonna be like. And yeah, just go for it. And I certainly know from my experience with everyone in the natural history unit, I think so many people are so open to speaking and are really willing to give you some time, and everyone's so friendly and supportive. So just have confidence, just go for it, and yeah, you'll do fine. You'll do just fine. Yeah.
Well, I totally agree, and a perfect place to end. Thank you very much indeed. It's been fascinating talking to you. And yeah, well, that's the first episode done and dusted.
Woo!
Thank you very much indeed. That's actually